Hey Pre-Algebra, this is Mrs. Freeman. This is lesson 5.2a, the Pythagorean theorem. So we're just going to talk about the first half of this lesson today because it's a little bit lengthy. So label your notes lesson 5.2a. And here is what we're going to get into. So this is Pythagoras. We talked about him yesterday. He was a Greek mathematician and philosopher who studied one of the most famous rules in mathematics, and that rule is the Pythagorean theorem. We talked about it a little bit yesterday, and you worked with some starburst and kind of proved the theorem, but we're going to actually solve some problems with it today. So your vocabulary word here is the word theorem. So I want you to write that down, and it is just a rule in mathematics. So a rule in mathematics is called a theorem. So Pythagoras came up with this theorem called the Pythagorean theorem. So go ahead and write this down as well, the Pythagorean theorem. Pythagorean just comes from his name, Pythagoras. And it was a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And this is probably a theorem that you've heard somewhere before in a movie or something and you didn't know what it meant. So we're going to learn what it means. A squared plus b squared equals c squared. So remember, the shape that this works for is these right triangles. So I do want you to sketch this white box here, this right triangle. And I want you to remember the most important part is the side right across from the right angle is always going to be your hypotenuse. So we have two legs in a right triangle, and then the side across from the right angle is going to be your hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is always the longest side. And then the legs are the two shorter sides. Okay, so you do have two vocabulary words on this screen, legs and hypotenuse. So I'm going to pause and let you define both of those words, legs and hypotenuse. So again, the legs are the two sides that touch the right angle. They're the two shorter sides, and the hypotenuse is the one across from the right angle, and it is the longest side. Go ahead and pause this video if you need more time, because I'm going to move on to the next slide here. So we're going to start solving some problems with these. It says find the length of the hypotenuse of the triangle. So I've got one length, 5, another length of 12, and then this side that I don't know. So because this is across from the right angle, this is my hypotenuse, or C. Okay, if you would, on your diagram that you drew of this right triangle, go ahead and label your legs A and B and your hypotenuse C. So the hypotenuse always has to be C, and then A and B are your legs. It doesn't matter which one's which. But if I'm looking at example 1 here, it's actually telling me that I'm looking for C because that's the letter that it's giving me there. But, of course, they can use any variable they want, so maybe sometimes you'll have an x there, and you'll have to figure out whether they want a, b, or c. So c is always the one right across from the right angle, so in this case I'm looking for c. So if I write a squared plus b squared equals c squared, as long as you get a in the right spot, as long as you get c in the right spot, the other two don't matter. So c is what I'm looking for. That means these two legs are a and b, and it does not matter which one is which. Because what I'm going to do is plug these in for a and b and add them together. So if I did them in the other order, 12 squared plus 5 squared, I'd get the same thing. So all I did was put those numbers where they go. 5 in place of a, 12 in place of b, and then c is what I don't know. That's what I'm going to solve for. So I'm going to go ahead and use my calculator. You can also use your note card that we made. 5 squared, if I type that in my calculator, that is 25. And 12 squared is 144. C squared, I don't know. So c squared is going to stay c squared. Okay, this is just an equation, so I'm going to go ahead and solve what I can. And I sure can add these two things together. 25 plus 144, that's going to give me 169 is equal to c squared. But remember, I'm not looking for c squared, I'm looking for c. So this is cool, it's giving me what c squared is, but I need to know what c is. So what I need to get rid of is this little squared. So I'm going to do the opposite of squaring something, which is what we've talked about this week. I'm going to square root both sides of this equation. The square root of c squared is just c. These cancel here. And then the square root of 169, again, you can use your calculator or you can use your note card. And it is 13. So there is my answer. Remember, we said the hypotenuse had to be the longest, so that means I better have gotten an answer bigger than 5 and 12. So because I did, I'm in good shape. If I got something smaller than 12, then I would need to check my math because something would be wrong. Okay, so this came out with a pretty answer, or what we call a perfect square, because I just got 13. No decimals, nothing like that. So let's see what happens when we do get a decimal. We're going to do a couple of these. Looking at A first. It says 7, but we're going to call them A and B. I've got, this is my missing side down here. Notice it is the one across from the right angle, so I'm looking for C. That means 4 and 8 are A and B, and it does not matter which is which. So I'm going to start with a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And now I'm going to put these things where they go. So instead of a, I'm going to write 4. B is 8. And then c is what I'm looking for. Okay, 4 squared is 16. 8 squared is 64. And c squared is going to stay c squared because I don't know what that is yet. I can go ahead and add those things together. 16 plus 64, that is 80. So what I just did was I solved for c squared, but I don't want c squared, I want c. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And that's going to give me c on the right side, and the square root of 80 using my calculator is going to give me about 8.9. Okay, notice it says round to the nearest tenth, so that's what I'm doing here, is rounding to the nearest tenth. Okay, so if your calculator said something like this, that is very possible. So there's two different ways that you can get an answer here. One of those is radical form, and that is where it simplifies that square root down as much as it can. So for example, 80 is 16 times 5. And the square root of 16 is 4. It's a perfect square. So that's where this 4 radical 5 comes from. That's not important to you as long as you know that this is called radical form. So if it's asking you for radical form, that's when you want to enter this circled answer right here. Okay. Most of the time, however, though, it's going to ask you to round to the nearest tenth. So if you get a radical answer and you want a decimal answer, you're just going to push that button above the enter button that looks like this. And it's going to change that 4 radical 5 into this 8.9 for you. So everybody try that. Type in the square root of 80. You're probably going to get this 4 radical 5 unless you have a different calculator. And then just hit that button above the enter button. And it should change it into, it's about 8.94427, blah, 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 blah. But we rounded to the nearest tenth, 8.9. Okay, let's try B. Again, I'm looking for C. I'm looking for the one across from the right angle. So here's A and B. It does not matter which one's which. You'll get the same thing either way. I'm going to write it up here. If I plug these in where they go, I'm going to let A be 6 and B be 3. 6 squared is 36, plus 3 squared, which is 9. 36 plus 9 is 45. But that is C squared, and I want to know what C is, so I'm going to take the square root of both sides. Again, your calculator is going to give that to you in radical form first. So let's see. If I type in the square root of 45, I'm going to get 3 radical 5. So if Delta Math was asking me for radical form, then this is the answer that I would put in. If it was asking me to round to the nearest tenth, which is what these directions are asking me to do, then I'm going to hit that button above the enter button. And I'm going to change it to a decimal, which is about, it ends up being 6.7082. But if I want to round to the nearest tenth, that's just that first digit, 6.7. Okay, so remember to look at the directions. If they're asking you to round to the nearest tenth, do that. If they're asking you for radical form, do that. If you get a pretty answer like this one, this is a perfect square, then you won't have to worry about that. But whenever we have decimals, there are 2 different ways that you can write the answer, but they are the same. Okay, so that is all for 5.2a. You do need to show your work on paper and upload it. Don't forget that step. And you may go ahead and get started on Delta Math. Have a great day.